Seattle glittered that night, and so did the Pierce name. Charles Pierce had taken over the top floor of a waterfront hotel to celebrate two things he loved most: his birthday and a newly won city project that would stamp the family company's logo across another skyline photo. Waiters moved like clockwork through a garden of glass and steel. A jazz trio threaded soft brass through the room. The view of Elliott Bay threw back the light like a second chandelier. Alexandra Pierce, his only child, smiled when the cameras turned toward her and lowered her eyes when the toasts began. She had grown up inside this world: mahogany boardrooms, ribbon cuttings, and handshakes that lasted just long enough to seal alliances. Tonight, in a pale dress that made her look like a quiet flame, she did what she'd always done: stand where her father wanted her to stand, say what he hoped she would say, and make the family look whole. But the role felt smaller every year. People spoke to her as if she were the hinge on a door that men intended to walk through. Charles had plans for that hinge. He had invited a partner's son. Motvey called him with the practiced warmth of a man who liked foreign capital and obedient outcomes. Tall, expensively bored, Motvey talked about cars the way other people talked about people. He laughed at his own jokes. He told Alexandra they would make a striking couple at charity galas, as if marriage were a calendar of photographs. She listened because her father watched them from across the room, the way a coach watches a drill, grading form, ignoring breath. She stepped away for air and reached the glass balcony. Seattle's lights ran down the hills like a string of landing strips. A ferry slid across the black water. She was thinking of architecture school sketches rolled up in a closet she barely opened anymore when she heard a voice behind her that didn't try to sell her anything. "Happy birthday to your father," the man said. "And congratulations on the stadium bid. I'm Max Bennett." She knew the name. Her father had mentioned a young project manager who made bad luck look like a solvable equation. Up close, he wore the same black suit as 100 other men in the room, but it fit him like he didn't need it. He spoke plainly. He didn't glance over her shoulder to see who else might be more useful. Inside, the band began a slow standard. Max lifted a hand, not a flourish, just a simple invitation. Alexandra hesitated, then nodded. On the dance floor, he held her at the distance the song required. The city turned softly around them. He did not talk about her father or the contract. He asked where she liked to walk in the mornings and whether she still sketched buildings when no one was watching. She laughed, surprised to hear it. For 3 minutes, the world shrank to steps and time. She felt something she did not often feel in rooms like this, seen, not displayed. When the song ended, he didn't press his luck, he thanked her, and she felt the absence of his hand like the untying of a ribbon. Charles appeared before the applause fully died. The smile he offered guests did not reach his eyes when he looked at Max. "Mr. Bennett," he said, cordial as a chilled blade. "Enjoying the evening?" "Very much, sir," Max answered. "You should be proud." "We are," Charles said, and the "we" meant the family, the company, the network, everything that had a seat at the table. His glance flicked to Alexandra, then back to Max. "My daughter is promised for introductions tonight. You'll excuse us." He steered Alexandra toward Motvey, who had already positioned himself by the bar as if posing for a future donor wall. "He's dependable," Charles murmured. "He understands what legacy means." "Legacy," she repeated, and tasted the word the way one tastes medicine. The rest of the hour moved like a carefully drawn blueprint. Photographs, toasts, a walkthrough of the room with Motvey reciting benefits like a prospectus. But the blueprint left no place for error. When Charles finally released her to the edges of the party, Alexandra returned to the balcony and watched the fairy lights move like steady breathing across the bay. Dependable, legacy, introductions. The words lined up in her head like columns, and beneath them, the memory of a plain invitation and a simple dance that had felt like a door swinging open. When her father joined her again, she didn't turn. "You're making this difficult," he said softly, not unkind. "There are partnerships to honor." "There is a life to live," she replied. He exhaled, the patient sound he used in negotiation. Alexandra, we do not marry stories. We marry sense. She faced him. In the window's reflection, there were two figures inside a city that measured everything. Then I will be the first exception, she said, voice calm. I won't marry Motvy. The jazz slid into another song. Somewhere behind them, a toast rose and broke like a wave. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. We'll speak about this at home. We're speaking about it now, she answered, and the door inside her did not swing shut. It held. It stayed open. Later, when the party folded into night and the last camera flashed, Alexandra knew that something had changed. The decision wasn't a storm, it was a line. She had crossed it. Love on one side, power on the other, and a father who believed the two could not meet. The morning after the party felt heavier than the Seattle rain tapping at the windows. Alexandra had barely slept, replaying the words she and her father had exchanged on the balcony. Over coffee gone cold, Charles Pierce folded the Seattle Times and looked across the table at his daughter with the same steady gaze that had closed 100 business deals. We should revisit what you said last night, he began. I meant it, Alexandra replied before he could continue. I won't marry Motvy, father. I don't love him, and I won't build a life on something I don't feel. Charles sighed, patient but immovable. Love, he said, is a luxury that fades. Partnership, family alliances, those endure. Motvy's family strengthens ours. And what about me? She asked, her voice trembling but firm. Am I just a name to trade? The silence between them stretched taut. Then, with the precision of a man offering terms, Charles leaned forward. 6 months, he said. If, in 6 months, you find someone suitable, someone I can respect as my successor's partner, I will not press this match. If not, Alexandra, you will marry Motvy. That is my final word. It wasn't the freedom she craved, but it was more than she expected. Alexandra nodded, her decision made. 6 months to find not just love, but a future on her own terms. After the first week passed in a haze of questions and second guesses, until a familiar voice called her name in the lobby of Pierce Construction. Max Bennett was there, sleeves rolled up, discussing site plans with a team of engineers. When he saw her, his expression softened into something that wasn't part of a pitch. Didn't expect to see you here, he said, falling into step beside her. Neither did I, she admitted, but I'm glad I did. That afternoon turned into coffee at a small place on Pine Street, far from the glass towers and polite whispers of her father's world. One coffee became another a few days later, then late-night conversations that stretched into early morning. Max spoke of buildings as if they were living things, how steel bore weight like muscle, how light could transform a space into a sanctuary. Alexandra spoke of the sketches she'd hidden away, the dreams she'd shelved because they didn't fit the Pierce legacy. They began to see each other often, sometimes at the company cafeteria, sometimes walking by the waterfront where the city lights trembled on the water. The connection that had begun with a dance deepened into something harder to deny. 3 months into their quiet, growing closeness, Max stopped mid-conversation one evening as they walked beneath the canopy of cherry blossoms in Volunteer Park. Alexandra, he said, his voice steady but vulnerable, I don't want to just be someone you see between meetings. I'm in love with you. Her breath caught, and for the first time in years, the path ahead seemed like hers to choose. Then you should know, she said. I feel the same. Their relationship, once a secret, became impossible to hide. Whispers traveled quickly, reaching Charles Pierce's office like smoke. The confrontation was inevitable. He's not what I imagined for you, Charles said, pacing behind his desk. He's ambitious, yes, but ambition isn't pedigree. I don't need pedigree, Alexandra answered. I need someone who sees me as more than an asset. Charles stared out the window for a long moment before turning back. If this is truly what you want, then he will sign a prenuptial agreement. It will protect what I've built and what you will inherit. When Max heard the condition, he didn't hesitate. "I'm not here for your father's company," he said, taking Alexandra's hands in his. "I'm here for you. If a piece of paper proves that, then I'll sign it." 6 months after the night that changed everything, beneath an archway of white roses and the cool gray sky of a Seattle spring, Alexandra Pierce became Alexandra Bennett. The ceremony was grand, the guest list a who's who of the city's elite. Yet, as Max's fingers tightened gently around hers, the world beyond the vows faded. For the first time, Alexandra believed she had chosen a life for herself. Not one drafted in a boardroom, but one written from the heart. And as they danced beneath the lights, she allowed herself to believe it was the beginning of a future that would never betray her. The first 6 months of Alexandra and Max's marriage unfolded like the kind of dream she once believed only happened to other people. They moved into the Pierce family estate, a sprawling cedar-lined property overlooking Lake Washington, where the glass walls caught the sunrise and the gardens carried the scent of roses her mother had planted decades earlier. It was the house where she had taken her first steps, where birthdays had been celebrated beneath strings of golden lights. Now, it was where she woke each morning to the quiet rhythm of Max's breathing beside her. Their days settled into a comforting cadence. Alexandra returned to sketching in the sunroom her mother once used as a reading nook, filling page after page with designs she might someday bring to life. Max often worked late into the night, poring over construction proposals and blueprints, but he always found time to cook her breakfast on Sundays or take her to the farmer's market downtown. They spoke about traveling, Paris in the spring, Kyoto in the fall. She spoke about maybe teaching architecture part-time. For the first time in her adult life, the future felt like something she could build with her own hands, not something scripted for her. Then, in a single phone call, the scaffolding of that life collapsed. It was a rainy October evening when the police arrived at the estate. Charles and Eleanor Pierce had been driving back from a weekend in the San Juan Islands when their car skidded off the highway. Charles died instantly on impact. Eleanor clung to life for 3 hours before she, too, was gone. The world turned soundless. Alexandra remembered the officer's voice as if through water, the way her hand shook as she tried to dial Natalie, the scream that tore from her chest when she saw the wreckage photos. The funeral came and went like a fevered dream. Suits, condolences, white roses, the dull rhythm of a priest's voice. People said the right words. Accident, tragedy, gone too soon. But none of them touched the bottomless pit that had opened inside her. For weeks, Alexandra barely left the bedroom. Curtains stayed drawn. Meals went untouched. The sketches she had once loved lay abandoned on the floor. She stopped answering calls, stopped reading the emails piling up about board meetings and project deadlines. She could not imagine a world where her father's booming laugh and her mother's gentle counsel were not somewhere within reach. Max became her anchor. He answered the phone when investors called, signed documents when the board needed reassurance, and spoke gently to the staff when they looked to her for leadership. "Focus on breathing," he told her one night as she sat staring at the lake, her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I'll handle the rest until you're ready." She nodded because she didn't know what else to do. And little by little, that became the pattern. Max attended the monthly board meetings in her place, explaining that Alexandra needed time to grieve. He organized the finances, consolidating accounts, and setting up new systems so she wouldn't have to worry. When contractors or city officials needed approvals, he carried the papers upstairs for her to sign, assuring her they were standard renewals. The company her father had built, once the heartbeat of dinner conversations and childhood lessons, became something distant and abstract. Alexandra no longer recognized the flurry of emails or the acronyms in the reports Max read aloud. The bank statements, once familiar, became lines of numbers she didn't question. And Max, always calm, always patient, never once complained. "Take as long as you need," he would say, pressing a cup of tea into her hands. "The company is safe. You're safe. That's all that matters." 6 months into their marriage, Alexandra had believed she was building a life on her own terms. Now, she drifted through rooms heavy with ghosts, a house too quiet, a future too far away. The only constant in the silence was Max, his voice steady, his hands sure, his presence unshakable. She told herself that this was what love was supposed to look like, someone strong enough to hold you together when you could not hold yourself. But in the spaces between sleep and waking, where her parents' voices still called her name, a whisper of unease began to take root, so faint she barely noticed it. A year had passed since the night everything fell apart, and the air around the Pierce estate had slowly begun to shift. The house that once felt like a mausoleum of memories now held small traces of life again. Natalie Carter, Alexandra's closest friend since college, visited often, refusing to let her retreat into silence. She brought fresh flowers, coaxed Alexandra out for long walks through Discovery Park, and filled the kitchen with the sound of her easy laughter. Then there was Oliver, a clumsy golden retriever puppy Max, brought home one gray morning in March. "You need someone to pull you back into the world," he'd said as the little creature tumbled across the foyer. Oliver became Alexandra's shadow, nudging open her studio door each morning and curling up at her feet as she sketched. She still woke some nights with tears she couldn't explain, but the darkness didn't swallow her whole anymore. Her father's company, Pierce Construction, loomed larger and more complex than she remembered. Board reports arrived weekly, thick with terminology that read like a foreign language. When Max offered to handle operations until she was ready, Alexandra accepted without hesitation. "I don't understand the business side of things," she admitted one afternoon as they sat on the terrace overlooking the lake. "It was always Dad's world." Max reached for her hand. "Then let me shoulder it. I've been inside the company for years. I know how to keep it steady until you decide what role you want." It was easy to say yes. Soon, Max became the face of Pierce Construction, attending investor meetings, negotiating contracts, signing off on projects. Alexandra still signed documents when he brought them to her study, but she rarely read beyond the first page. She told herself this was trust, and for a time, that trust felt like freedom. Life fell into a rhythm that seemed almost peaceful. She sketched designs again, exploring the architectural ideas her father had once encouraged. She and Natalie spent weekends exploring Seattle's art galleries, and Oliver grew into a large, loyal companion. Max, always patient, always attentive, seemed to have built a cocoon around her. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that cocoon began to tighten. At first, it was small things. Max stayed later at the office, claiming the new downtown stadium project demanded his full attention. Dinner plans were postponed, weekends rescheduled. Alexandra didn't protest. After all, she had always admired his dedication. But the calls that used to happen in front of her now took place in another room. Doors gently closed between them. Messages arrived on his phone late at night, answered quickly and without explanation. One evening in early autumn, Alexandra prepared a dinner she and Max had loved during their first months of marriage: rosemary roast chicken and lemon tarts. He called an hour before he was due home, apologizing that a client meeting was running late. She told him it was fine, even as the food grew cold and Oliver whined under the table. Max slipped through the door after midnight with tired eyes and a vague smile. "Everything okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Just work," he said, kissing her cheek. "Go back to sleep." She believed him. She wanted to believe him. Weeks passed. His absences became more frequent, his explanations shorter. Alexandra noticed perfume clinging faintly to his jacket one night. Not hers, not anything she recognized. She brushed it aside. Max was devoted, she told herself. He had been her rock when the world fell apart. People in love didn't betray each other. Then, one rainy Tuesday, she stopped by the Pierce Construction offices unannounced. Max had forgotten the folder he needed for a meeting, and she thought it would be a nice surprise to bring it to him. His assistant hesitated when she saw Alexandra in the lobby. "He's busy," she said, glancing toward the corner office. "It's fine," Alexandra replied with a smile, pushing the door open gently. What she heard on the other side stopped her mid-step. Soft laughter, distinctly feminine, rising and falling like a shared secret. It was a small thing, a sound that could have meant nothing, and yet it echoed in Alexandra's chest long after it faded. For the first time since the accident, a crack formed in the trust she had wrapped around Max. It was nothing, she told herself as she handed over the folder and smiled as if nothing had shifted. But as she walked back through the rain to her car, that laughter played over and over in her mind, light, intimate, and utterly out of place. It was Max's idea that Alexandra should take a break. "You've been through too much," he'd said one evening as they sat by the fire, Oliver's head resting against her knee. A week away with Natalie would do good. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far from boardrooms and construction bids. At first she resisted, but the thought of salt air and silence tugged her. Natalie, thrilled by the idea, booked a small beach house on Whidbey Island. They spent their days walking along windswept shores and talking about everything but grief. Alexandra almost believed she was healing. Still, she caught herself thinking about Max, wondering if he was eating properly, if he was sleeping, if he missed her. On the fifth morning, clouds rolled in from the Pacific and rain hammered the windows. Natalie suggested they stay an extra night, but Alexandra shook her head. "I want to surprise him," she said. "I miss home." They packed early and caught the first ferry back to Seattle. When Alexandra arrived at Pierce Construction that afternoon, the building hummed with weekday energy. She decided to stop by Max's office before heading home. It was supposed to be a simple, joyful surprise, the kind she'd done often when they were newly married. But when she stepped off the elevator, the reaction was not what she expected. Max's secretary, usually warm and chatty, froze at the sight of her. "Mrs. Bennet," she stammered, nearly knocking over a cup of coffee. "We didn't expect you today." "I came back early," Alexandra said lightly. "Is Max in?" "He's in a meeting," the woman replied too quickly, glancing nervously at the closed office door. Something in Alexandra's chest tightened. She knocked once and opened the door. The room was empty. Papers lay scattered across Max's desk, his jacket draped over the back of his chair. But there was no meeting, no client, no staff, no husband. "I guess I'll wait," she murmured. The secretary swallowed hard. "Maybe you should call him first." It was nothing, or so Alexandra told herself as she left the office. But the unease clung to her like a shadow. That laugh she had heard weeks ago, the perfume on his jacket, the late nights. Each small detail now seemed like a piece of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. That night, long after Max returned home with another vague story about a last-minute meeting, Alexandra opened a drawer in her father's study. Inside was a worn business card. James Holloway, Private Investigations. He had worked with Charles Pierce years ago, vetting business partners and uncovering threats before they could take root. She hesitated, staring at the number. Then she called. James met her 2 days later in a discreet coffee shop near Green Lake. He listened quietly as she explained her suspicions, then slid a small black box across the table. "A recorder," he said. "One for his car, one for the office. You'll know soon enough whether you're imagining things." Her hands trembled as she planted the devices, one tucked beneath the passenger seat of Max's Range Rover, the other hidden inside a shelf behind his office desk. She told herself it was paranoia, that she would delete the recordings the moment they confirmed she was wrong. But when she pressed play that night, the truth came crashing through the speakers. It started with laughter, light, familiar, and cruel in its intimacy. Then Max's voice, low and warm in the way he once spoke only to her. "Vanessa," he whispered, and Alexandra's stomach turned cold. "I hate leaving you at night." The woman's voice, Vanessa Gray, a name Alexandra had heard only in passing from company gossip, answered with a soft laugh. Then don't. I can't, Max replied. Not yet. They spoke of dinners, of weekends, of things they would do when the time was right. He called her angel, my world, my light. Every phrase Alexandra once believed was meant for her alone. She couldn't breathe. The man who had held her through grief, who had promised forever beneath white roses, was living another life just beyond her sight. But the worst was still to come, because the conversation didn't end with love. It shifted, darker, sharper. Vanessa's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm tired of waiting, Max. You said it wouldn't be long. It won't be, he murmured. Everything has to happen in the right order. What if she never lets go? She will, Max said. One way or another. The recording clicked to silence, but the words did not fade. They looped in Alexandra's mind, a countdown she couldn't yet understand. The betrayal was deeper than infidelity. It was a shadow stretching beyond her marriage. And for the first time, she felt fear curl in the pit of her stomach. 3 days passed before Alexandra found the courage to listen again. She waited until Max had left for work, the house quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and Oliver's soft breathing by the fireplace. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the small recorder from its hiding place inside the cedar chest. The previous recording had shattered her trust. What she heard now would splinter something far deeper. The conversation began innocently, like the last one, Max and Vanessa laughing about a trip they had taken under the guise of a business conference. Then Vanessa's tone shifted, slicing through the soft background noise. So, she said, her voice low and deliberate, how much longer do I have to wait for her to die? The words landed like a blow. Alexandra froze, her breath catching in her throat. Soon, Max answered, his voice steady in a way that chilled her. The medication works slowly. It has to build up in her system. Vanessa sighed theatrically. You're sure she's still taking it? She hasn't missed a dose in weeks, Max replied. I make sure of it. Every morning in her tea, every night in her vitamins. A wave of nausea rolled through Alexandra. Her mind replayed countless small moments. Max handing her a mug of chamomile before bed. Max placing a glass of fresh juice on the table at breakfast. Max gently reminding her not to forget her pills. She had trusted those gestures, seen them as proof of love. Now they felt like something far more sinister. God, Max, Vanessa whispered. I just want to wake up next to you without hiding anymore. And we will, he promised. Once she's gone, everything that's hers becomes ours. The company, the house, the accounts, everything. Vanessa giggled, a sound that made Alexandra's skin crawl. My husband is going to be the richest man in Seattle. Correction, Max said smoothly. Our money. Our future. It was then Vanessa said something that made Alexandra's heart stop. 6 years, she murmured. 6 damn years of waiting, planning, playing this stupid game. And now we're so close. Patience, Max warned. We've come too far to make mistakes now. 6 years. Alexandra did the math without meaning to. 6 years ago, Max had first joined Pierce Construction. 5.5 years ago, her parents had died in what police called a freak accident. And 6 years ago, she had met Max for the very first time. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Until that moment, she had clung to one fragile certainty, that whatever else Max had done, the loss of her parents had been random, cruel fate. But now that certainty crumbled. Could it have been planned? Her father had been known for his uncompromising business ethics, for refusing partnerships that didn't align with his vision. Over the years, Charles Pierce had made enemies. What if Max had been one of them? What if he had entered their lives with a purpose from the very beginning? Alexandra tried to steady her breathing. Maybe she was spiraling. Maybe grief and betrayal had twisted her perception. And yet, 6 years. Her mind replayed details she had once dismissed. The way Max had appeared in her father's company seemingly out of nowhere. His meteoric rise through the ranks. The subtle ways he had won her father's trust. She remembered the crash report. Mechanical failure, they had said. No foul play suspected. She had accepted it because she needed to. But what if she had been wrong? The room spun around her. She clutched the edge of the table, fighting the urge to scream. Oliver patted over and nudged her knee with his nose, sensing her distress. She buried her fingers in his fur, grounding herself. If Max had poisoned her parents, if he was poisoning her, then nothing in her life was real. The love she had believed in was a weapon turned against her. The man who held her through her darkest nights was waiting for her to die. The door opened downstairs. "Lex!" Max called, his voice warm and familiar. "I brought dinner." Alexandra's heart raced as footsteps approached. She stared at the glass of water on the counter, the unopened bottle of vitamins by the sink. Her hands shook as she swept the recorder into a drawer and forced herself to stand. "Up here," she called back, her voice miraculously steady. Max appeared in the doorway, smiling as if nothing in the world were wrong. "I picked up your favorite Thai curry. Thought we'd have a quiet night." Alexandra managed a small smile, though it felt like her skin no longer fit. "That sounds perfect." But as she watched him set the table and pour her tea, every detail felt heavy with meaning. The warmth of his smile, the steady tone of his voice, all of it was camouflage. And beneath it, Alexandra now knew, was a whisper that promised her death. The morning light felt colder than usual as it filtered through the tall windows of the Pierce estate. Alexandra stood in the kitchen, staring at the steaming cup of tea Max had just placed before her. "Chamomile with honey," he said, smiling the way he always did. "You didn't sleep well again." Her pulse thudded in her throat. She forced herself to lift the cup, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside. "Thank you," she murmured. The scent was comforting, familiar, the same tea he'd made for her hundreds of times. Max turned away to grab his keys from the counter, humming softly. Alexandra brought the cup to her lips, letting the liquid touch her tongue but not swallow. As soon as he stepped out of the room, she slipped into the bathroom and spat the tea into the sink, rinsing her mouth over and over until the taste was gone. Then she knelt by the toilet and forced herself to vomit, just in case. Her heart pounded as she splashed cold water on her face. "Not today," she whispered to her reflection. "Not like this." When Max returned, she smiled as though nothing had changed. "I'll see you tonight," she said, kissing him lightly on the cheek. He smiled back, kissed her forehead, and left for work, unaware that the mask she wore was now armor. The moment the door closed, Alexandra's hands trembled as she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Raymond Scott," answered a deep, familiar voice. "Raymond, it's Alexandra Pierce," she said. "I need your help, and I need you to listen very carefully." Within an hour, Raymond was sitting across from her in the sunroom where her father once held board meetings. His hair was grayer now, his face more lined, but his eyes were still sharp. She told him everything. The recordings, the poisoning Vanessa's name, the reference to 6 years. She showed him the recorder, her hands barely steady. Raymond listened in silence until the last word faded. Then he exhaled slowly and said, "You were right to call me, and you were right not to drink that tea." "What do I do now?" she whispered. "First, we protect you. Second, we gather evidence that will hold up in court. Third," his eyes hardened, "we make sure he never touches a cent of what your father built." He asked to see the prenuptial agreement Charles Pierce had insisted upon before the wedding. Alexandra retrieved the leather folder from the study safe, where she had tucked it away the night before her wedding. Raymond flipped through the pages with the practiced precision of a man who had drafted hundreds of such documents. "Here," he said, tapping a paragraph. "This is the key clause. If you are alive, even if you're separated or in the process of divorce, Max Bennett has no claim to your estate, the company, or your family trust. Not a penny. Alexandra stared at the ink on the page, her stomach twisting. But if you die, Raymond finished, he inherits as your legal spouse. Everything. The company, the house, the accounts. Everything your parents built. The weight of it settled over her. Max wasn't just trying to kill her for freedom. He was trying to erase her, to rewrite the legacy her parents had entrusted to her name. Raymond carefully poured the remaining tea into a sterile vial he had brought with him. We'll send this to a toxicology lab. If he's poisoning you, we'll know. 3 days later, the results arrived. Raymond placed the report on her kitchen table, his expression grim. The analysis confirms the presence of a compound that interacts with opioids. It accumulates over time, damaging the liver and heart. In high enough doses, it would kill you, and any coroner would likely attribute the cause to natural organ failure. Alexandra pressed a hand to her mouth. He was going to make it look like I just died. Exactly, Raymond said, and he's done enough to make it stick. She slid a USB drive across the table, the recordings. Raymond plugged it into his laptop, and together they listened. Max's voice filled the room once more. The medication needs time to build up. Once she's gone, everything that's hers becomes ours. 6 years of planning. Vanessa's laughter followed, cruel and giddy. Then the part Alexandra had barely been able to process the first time. Like with her parents. Vanessa asked, "That wasn't an accident, was it?" Max's pause was brief but damning. Let's just say the brakes were never going to hold. Not after what I arranged. Raymond stopped the playback, his jaw clenched. This isn't just attempted murder, Alexandra. This is conspiracy, premeditation, possibly double homicide. Her breath caught. You think he killed my parents? I think, Raymond said carefully, we need to let the authorities hear this. But before we do, we prepare. Max Bennett is not a fool. If he's plotted this for 6 years, he will not go quietly. Alexandra stared out at the lake, her reflection fractured in the rippling water. The grief she had carried for so long twisted into something new. Not sorrow, not despair, but resolve. Max thought she was a pawn in a game he had already won. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The investigation began quietly, almost invisibly, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Raymond contacted a retired detective he trusted, someone who had worked with Charles Pierce years ago and still had allies inside the Seattle Police Department. Within days, a formal inquiry was opened into both the attempted poisoning of Alexandra Bennett and the fatal car crash that had claimed her parents' lives 5.5 years earlier. At first, the evidence seemed thin. The accident report had long been closed, and the official conclusion, mechanical brake failure on a rain-slick highway, had never been questioned. But Raymond insisted on pulling every archived file, every photo, every witness statement. Piece by piece, a different story began to emerge. The first break came from the original mechanics report. Buried in the fine print was a note about a scheduled maintenance, checked 2 weeks before the crash. The brakes had been declared fully functional, yet the post-crash assessment cited catastrophic brake line corrosion, damage that, according to an independent specialist, would have required months, not weeks, to develop naturally. Then came the financial trail. Through subpoenaed bank records and corporate filings, investigators traced a series of quiet payments from a shell company linked to Max Bennett to a now-retired traffic investigator, the very officer who had signed off on the accidental conclusion of the Pierce crash. The sum deposited in 3 installments totaled nearly $180,000. The corruption went deeper. Emails recovered from an encrypted server showed Max corresponding with a woman using an alias months before he and Alexandra had ever met. In those emails, they discussed removing obstacles and timing the inheritance correctly. One chilling line from Max read, "Once the estate is clear, the rest is simple." Marriage is the cleanest path. That woman was soon identified as Vanessa Gray, and with her name came the revelation that tied everything together. Vanessa was not just an ambitious outsider who had fallen for a wealthy man. She was the daughter of Richard Gray, the CEO of Greystone Holdings, a rival construction empire that Charles Pierce had outmaneuvered and bankrupted nearly a decade earlier. Charles had won the city's largest infrastructure contract at Greystone's expense, dismantling the company and humiliating Richard in the process. Richard Gray died penniless 3 years later. Vanessa, it turned out, had never forgotten. Investigators found that she had deliberately reinvented herself after her father's downfall, new degrees, new identity, new social circles, and eventually secured a position in a firm that did regular business with Pierce Construction. That was where she met Max. Surveillance logs, phone records, and financial transfers revealed a partnership that predated Max and Alexandra's first dance by years. It was Vanessa who had orchestrated the plan. She had cultivated Max as her inside man, helped him rise through the ranks of Pierce Construction, and coached him on how to win Alexandra's trust. He had been charming, patient, attentive, everything she needed him to be. And when Alexandra fell in love, she had walked willingly into the trap they'd spent 6 years constructing. Their plan was chilling in its precision. Step 1. Eliminate Charles and Eleanor Pierce, clearing the path to the company and its fortune. Step 2. Embed Max within Pierce Construction as an indispensable figure, ensuring his influence grew unchecked. Step 3. Secure his claim through marriage to Alexandra, binding her wealth and inheritance to him legally. And finally, Step 4. Remove Alexandra herself, quietly without suspicion, using a poison subtle enough to mimic natural causes. Once she was gone, Max would inherit everything. And Vanessa, the daughter of the man Charles Pierce had ruined, would finally have her revenge. The investigators presented their findings to the King County District Attorney's Office. The recordings, the payment records, the tampered brake line analysis, and the recovered emails painted a damning picture, not just of attempted murder, but of conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. For Alexandra, the revelations came like aftershocks, each one shaking the foundation of the life she had built. Every tender word Max had spoken, every promise he had made, now felt like part of a script written long before she ever knew his name. Even her parents' deaths, the tragedy that had hollowed her world, were not cruel chance but calculated murder. There were nights when she sat awake until dawn, staring at old photographs of her father and wondering how she hadn't seen any of it. But Raymond reminded her gently, monsters don't come wearing fangs and claws. They wear suits. They bring you tea. They hold you when you cry. It was no longer just about justice for herself. It was about her parents, whose voices had been silenced for a plan built on greed and hatred. It was about reclaiming everything Max and Vanessa had tried to steal, not just her fortune, but her story. The case was building momentum now, each new discovery adding weight to the avalanche that was coming. And as prosecutors prepared indictments and investigators compiled warrants, Alexandra Pierce, no longer a pawn, no longer a target, waited for the storm she knew was about to break. The courthouse in downtown Seattle was packed the day the trial began. Reporters crowded the marble steps, cameras flashing as Alexandra stepped from the black sedan and walked through the front doors, Raymond Scott at her side. For months, the case had consumed headlines. Heiress targeted in 6-year plot to steal fortune. Pierce Construction poisoning scandal, love, betrayal, and murder in Seattle's elite. Yet none of the noise outside compared to the quiet storm that churned within her. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now it was here. The prosecution laid out their case with devastating precision. Exhibit after exhibit, they showed the jury how Max Bennett and Vanessa Gray had conspired over 6 years to destroy the Pierce family and seize its fortune. They presented the toxicology reports, proving that Alexandra's tea contained a compound designed to build up slowly and fatally in her system. They brought in chemists who explained how the substance interacted with opioids to mimic natural organ failure, a detail that could have fooled even a seasoned coroner. Then came the financial evidence. Records of shell companies linked to Max funneling money to corrupt investigators, offshore accounts Vanessa had established to launder future inheritance funds, and internal emails from Pierce Construction that Max had falsified to consolidate control in his hands. But it was the recordings that silenced the courtroom. As Max's voice echoed through the speakers, "The medication works slowly. Once she's gone, everything becomes ours," a murmur rippled through the jury box. Vanessa's voice followed, cold and calculating. 6 years of planning, like with her parents. And then the line that ended any pretense of innocence. "The brakes were never going to hold. Not after what I arranged." Max sat stone-faced as the evidence mounted, but his composure cracked when Vanessa, in a desperate bid for leniency, took the stand and turned on him. She detailed the conspiracy from its inception, how her father's downfall had fueled her hatred, how she had recruited Max, how they had plotted every step from the fatal crash to the slow poisoning of Alexandra. "It was all about revenge," she admitted, her voice trembling. "He wanted the company. I wanted the Pierce family to suffer." The defense tried everything, claiming the recordings were doctored, arguing the poison had been planted, suggesting Vanessa had acted alone. But the web of evidence was too tight, too thorough. Raymond's meticulous preparation and the prosecution's relentless case left little room for doubt. When the verdict was read 3 weeks later, the courtroom was so silent Alexandra could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Max Bennett, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy in the deaths of Charles and Eleanor Pierce, guilty. The judge's voice was steady and final. "Max Bennett, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps swept the room. Max stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. For the first time since the night they met, Alexandra felt nothing when she looked at him. Vanessa Gray, charged as an accomplice and for obstruction of justice, received 10 years in state prison. She wept as the sentence was read, but Alexandra did not look her way. The time for tears had passed long ago. After the sentencing, Alexandra stepped out into the crisp spring air. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but their noise faded beneath the quiet certainty that settled in her chest. It was over. The people who had destroyed her family, her trust, and nearly her life were behind bars. In the weeks that followed, Alexandra took back the reins of Pierce Construction. With Raymond's help, she dissolved Max's fraudulent contracts, restored the company's board, and reclaimed her place as its rightful head. She enrolled in a graduate program in architecture, the dream she had once abandoned, determined to understand every layer of the empire her father had built. She spent long hours in the office Charles had designed for himself, now her own. The first thing she did was rebuild it, new blueprints on the walls, fresh sketches pinned beside her father's original plans. In the corner, she placed his favorite drafting table, its surface worn smooth by decades of work. Each morning, Alexandra stood at that table and traced her fingers over the grain of the wood, a silent promise to continue what he had started. She revisited the projects her father had left unfinished and saw them through. Bridges, schools, housing developments that carried his vision of building not just structures, but communities. Seattle's skyline began to change again, not under Max Bennett's ambition or Vanessa Gray's vengeance, but under Alexandra Pierce's hands. The company bore the weight of tragedy, yes, but it also bore the strength of survival. And as the sun set over the water one evening, casting golden light across the office floor, Alexandra whispered to the memory of her parents, "It's ours again, all of it, and I'll protect it. I swear I will." The years that followed did not erase the scars, but they transformed them. Alexandra Pierce rebuilt her life from the ground up, not as the heiress sheltered behind her father's empire, nor as the naive woman who once mistook manipulation for devotion, but as a leader who understood the weight of legacy and the strength of resilience. She no longer lived in the estate where her parents had died. Too many ghosts lingered there, too many memories stained by betrayal. Instead, she bought a modern townhouse near Capitol Hill, with wide windows that let the morning light flood in, and a rooftop garden where she spent quiet evenings sketching. Oliver, now older and slower, still followed her everywhere, a silent guardian of the new life she had carved out. Pierce Construction thrived under her leadership. No longer content to sign documents she didn't read, Alexandra immersed herself in the work. She earned a degree in architecture, something she had once only dreamed of, and used it to expand the company's vision. Under her direction, Pierce Construction shifted from luxury developments to projects that built schools, hospitals, and community centers. The company's profits grew, but more importantly, so did its purpose. Board members who once doubted her now sought her counsel. Investors spoke of her not as Charles Pierce's daughter, but as the visionary CEO who had redefined a century-old company. Even the media, once obsessed with the scandal of betrayal and attempted murder, now praised her as a symbol of resilience in the face of unthinkable loss. As for Max Bennett, he existed now only as a name in legal documents and headlines. He had filed 2 appeals, both denied. He would spend most of his life behind bars, stripped of the fortune and future he had tried to steal. Vanessa Gray had been released early on parole after serving 8 years, but Alexandra did not think of her often. They were no longer villains in her story. They were simply gone. Alexandra had promised herself she would not let hatred be the thing that defined her, and she kept that promise. She no longer wished Max dead. She no longer felt her heart race when she passed the courthouse or heard his name in passing. He was not a nightmare anymore, only a scar. And scars, she had learned, were proof not of pain, but of survival. Sometimes, when she walked past a cafe and overheard someone affectionately call their partner Bunny, she would pause, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "At least it's not hamster," she would murmur under her breath, a private joke born from a life she no longer lived. On the anniversary of the trial's conclusion, Alexandra returned to the small pier where her father used to take her sailing as a child. The water shimmered gold beneath the late summer sun, and the wind carried the faint scent of cedar from the shoreline. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I kept my promise. I protected what you built, and I built something new." It was then she realized something essential. Justice was not always a gunshot in the dark or a verdict shouted in a courtroom. Sometimes justice was far quieter, a heartbeat that refused to stop, a dream rebuilt from ashes, a woman standing tall where she had once been broken. Alexandra Pierce had lost everything, and yet she had risen, stronger, wiser, untouchable, and that, more than any sentence, any headline, any revenge, was the justice Max Bennett could never steal from her.